Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pula. My guest today is Scott Ritter and Marcia Baker, and we're going to discuss the problem of starvation due to the war in the Ukraine. And there was an article written in the New York Times that said that the war is causing widespread starvation, poverty, and premature deaths. And Scott, in all the conversations that we've had, you have more or less spelled out the fact that we are the aggressors in this conflict. So, if that's the case, would you say that the West, and NATO is responsible for all of this starvation, poverty, premature death, all the suffering? What do you think?
I mean, the short answer is yes, of course. Look, we know now, there's no doubt that the Western-driven narrative that this was a precipitous, unprovoked war of aggression on the part of Russia invading Ukraine, and therefore everything that has transpired is Russia's fault. It's a false narrative. How do we know this? Well, we have the confessions of Petro Poroshenko, the former Ukrainian president, Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, and Hollande, the former French president, that the 2014 Minsk Accords was a sham. They had no intention of following through. You know, the Minsk Accords, of course, were supposed to put in place a ceasefire that would lead to a peace settlement, that would lead to changes constitutionally in Ukraine to respect the rights of ethnic Russians in the Donbass and preserving the Donbass as part of Ukrainians' territorial sovereignty. Had Ukraine implemented Minsk, there would never have been a war. I'll just say that one more time so people understand what I'm saying. Had Ukraine implemented Minsk, there would never have been this war. And therefore, the problems that are generated from this war would not have occurred. But now it gets even worse, because why did they treat it as a sham? They treat it as a sham to buy time to build a Ukrainian military by NATO that was intended to launch a war of aggression against Russia and the ethnic Russians in Donbass, meaning that aggression and the intent for aggression always resided with the West and Ukraine. It never resided with Russia. Russia was always seeking a peaceful outcome, one, by insisting on implementation of the agreed upon Minsk Accords. This is something that Russia was pursuing up until the very end. And two, trying to de-escalate by putting out draft treaties in December of 2021 that sought a new European security framework that would de-escalate the crisis. Russia was the only nation seeking diplomatic outcomes for a peaceful, nonviolent solution to the problem in Ukraine. The West and Ukraine ignored this. We ended up with a war. Why is this important? Because the decision to go to war was made by the West. And again, people say, Scott, no, it's Russia that invaded Ukraine. Time out, people. Go back to April 2008 and reread the memorandum written by William Burns, the US ambassador to Russia, when he talked about the potential of expanding NATO in bringing in Ukraine. He said in April that if we go forward with this policy, it will inevitably lead to a conflict with Russia, where Russia will have no choice but to militarily intervene into Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose Donbass and Crimea. 2008, this was written in April. In November, we invited Ukraine to join NATO. What that meant is we knew that by inviting Ukraine into NATO, that inevitably there would be a Russian military intervention. And then in 2014, we provoked a coup in Kiev, the Minsk Accords, 8 years of buildup. The intent for aggression was always on the part of the West. So now you have to understand, therefore, that if the West is talking about aggression, the West should therefore have implemented policies that sought to mitigate the harm that would come from this. But there were no such policies, none whatsoever. There was no thought about food supplies, about the role played by Ukraine in supplying food, about the role played by Russia in supplying food, the role played by Russian gas and Russian ammonia and Ukrainian ammonia in generating critical fertilizers for the world. You know who did think about this? Russia. Russia thought about this. Russia wanted to keep all these things going. Russia is the party that said we need to keep food supplies going. Russia's the party that said let's come up with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia's the party that negotiated continuance of the operation of ammonia supply lines. Russia's the one that said we keep natural gas flowing. Russia was shot down in every venue by the West, who sought to impose sanctions. So when we talk about, what is happening in the world today, this critical food shortage that's triggered by, in large part, but not in totality, by what's happening in Ukraine, it is the West that is to blame, and only the West is to blame. Russia's the one that it wasn't Russia that had its ships seized in European ports, ships containing fertilizer. It was the West that seized the Russian ships. Russia has been asking for the release of these ships. It's not Russia that's trying to strong arm the world to control prices. Russia's offered to give its grain and its fertilizer for free to the nations that need it most. And why is this important? And I'll let Marcia, I think Marcia could probably talk about this better. A key aspect of the concept of food supplies isn't that it's Ukrainian grain that's going to feed the starving people in the world. It's about creating price stability, because the vast majority of the global food aid comes in the form of monetary grants given to nations or organizations who will then buy food. And what's happening because of the Ukraine thing is the price of food has gone through the roof. And so all the money that was allocated to purchase food isn't purchasing enough food. And Russia sought to bypass this with direct provision of the grain to the nations that need it most. And the West is doing its best to stop it. But it's the West that's to blame on this, not Russia.
Okay, before I go to Marcia, I got to ask you one more question. What countries are most affected by this horrific situation?
Well, primarily you look at the Middle East and Africa. The standard Yemen, Somalia. We're seeing food shortages in Lebanon, Tunisia. It's Africa and the Middle East that are suffering the most. But the potential is global. If we have drought, if we have continued economic crises, famine can spread everywhere. I think, again, Marcia can correct me on this, but there's around 350 million people in the world today that are on the cusp of starvation. That's a lot of people. And that number can grow dramatically if we have crop failures around the world, and there will be crop failures if Russian fertilizer doesn't get to the world's farmers in a timely fashion.
Marcia?
Well, I'll just add to the picture that Scott painted absolutely dramatically. Let me say about the context of the current world food situation and growing number of facing starvation in Ukraine. First, as it was well known, the role that Ukraine played, not just Russia too, but in exports for wheat, corn and maize especially, and also sunflowers for years, since the 1990s, when what you could call we have a military industrial complex in the world. We have a globalist farm and food complex in the world. And so since the 1990s, everyone from Cargill, Bunge, Louis Dreyfus, and the financial houses, Goldman Sachs out of London, moved in and set up shop to use Ukraine's tremendous Chernozem black soil capacity and other capacity for the purpose of being an export source nation in the world markets. Okay, fine. And so it was well known in the recent years during the Minsk agreement period that if you provoked a combat situation in Ukraine, you would lose X million tons in both production and export unless you made arrangements. No arrangements made. And on a world scale, now let me mention a second contextual point. Total world grains are going down now from year to year. And we may be, in the current crop year, we may be down 25 to 50 million tons. That's a lot of people that it can feed, directly or indirectly. And Ukraine does not account for all of this. The issue is that the hyperinflation, the disruption to fertilizer, to gas, to fuel, to machinery parts, to everything, is making food production iffy on farms on all continents, with the exception, I think, of the careful arrangements in China and the careful arrangements Russia has made about its wheat production, which has gone up, and some other minor exceptions. So that's number two. This is number three. I just want to say this world picture is completely blacked out of the general citizen's knowledge. Instead, you get the narrative that Russia is causing starvation, Russia is causing your cows to go dry, Russia is causing everything. And so remember, put it together in your mind that in the last few years, certainly before February 2022, you've had farmers on the streets in Germany and in Holland and in Italy and in India, because on the world situation basis, they haven't been able to have what they need to farm properly due to everything from what you could say the green agenda to other regulations to just hyperinflation. They can't get what they need. They're prevented from being able to produce food. You know you're in trouble in society in the West if your farmers are on the streets because they can't have the ability to produce food. So in that context, starvation or just hunger has been increasing in the last several years. And that's the process and the dynamic that we have to address. And by the way, I can stop here, but we can address it. Sovereign nations could intervene, even as Scott alluded to. Maybe you take measures to mitigate what you shouldn't be provoking war in Ukraine. It was provoked, but you could mitigate measures by growing extra food in Canada or making an effort in Argentina, or none of that has been going on there's been no emergency task force meetings involving farmers and leaders of major capitals in the West to make contingency arrangements to produce more food or get it where it should go or divert it from where it has been going. None.
Scott?
Let me just throw in, first of all, Marcia, thank you very much for that. That was very informative. I'll just correct you on one thing. It's not Russia that's causing all the problems, Marcia. Don't you know? It's Putin personally.
Oh, you're right. I made a mistake.
Yeah. So, we have to keep that in mind. Vladimir Putin is the single most evil, powerful man in the world, and he is responsible for everything that goes wrong in the world today. But that aside, one of the big problems, because Marcia said, this could be solved through, mitigation. Sound play. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, if you apply logic to just about any problem set out there, when it's a supply issue, when you lose one source of supply, you mitigate that by finding another source of supply and things of that nature, and you seek a balance. One of the big problems, though, is that what Marcia calls the world food complex, or whatever term you used, the notion that there's this massive international complex, but it's run by the United States. It's the United States that created this. When we had surpluses of wheat back in the 50s, we decided to use that wheat to leverage ourselves into, additional controls over the world, how to not just alleviate starvation, but how to leverage starvation into increased American global dominance. When you take a look at the laws that were passed by Congress regarding food aid, there's two kinds of food aid. But the largest one that's passed out there has a rider in it that says that we cannot participate in this or get involved in this unless you can explain how this furthers the dominance of the American farmer. Now, how can you speak of seeking to mitigate things when your sole concern isn't mitigation, but increasing the profitability of American farms, of the American agricultural sector. The United States is the biggest problem here because we don't care about the world. We only care about ourselves and how we further our economic domination of the world. And we use global starvation as a vehicle to assert control over global food supplies. For what purpose? Because then we can use that as a leverage to control people, to threaten people, to keep people on our side. If you don't want to starve to death, you need to enact policies that America is happy with. And then we threaten with sanctions like we're doing with Russia right now. Fortunately for the world, Russia had a plan in place to bypass this American pressure. Russia's never succumbed to this American global domination of the world food market. But tragically, for hundreds of millions of people who are on the cusp of starvation, many of them are in fact going to perish in the months and years to come because of American policy. Again, I challenge people. Go look up the two laws that are behind American food policy, and the law that's most in play has a rider that says that nothing can be done unless it increases the advantage of the American agricultural sector. That's not the way you go about being philanthropic. The whole concept of being philanthropic, caring for people, is to sacrifice to do good for others. But the American approach is to use the pain of others to further American dominance. And it's just a bad way to start policy.
So when you say the pain of others, I'm sure that neither one of you have a specific statistic, but how many people do you think might be on the verge of starvation right now, Marcia?
Well, you can rely in general on David Beasley of the World Food Program. He's a fellow from South Carolina. He's going out of office, unfortunately, in April. You have over 800 or 900 million people in different parts of the world who do not have enough food. Now, the degree of severity of their lack of food is, I think, in the range of 300 some million people that need to have food on an emergency basis supplied, or they are on the short road to starvation. And Scott mentioned some of the clear-cut national cases, everywhere from Yemen or portions of the Congo, DRC, Afghanistan. I'll be very specific. Let's take Afghanistan. You have somewhere around 38, 40 million people. You should be having you should be having, the preference is wheat. Afghanistan is #1 in the world in its dietary preference for getting most of its calories from wheat every day, 60 to 70%. They should be, they are producing in the last couple of years less than 4 million tons. They need 6 million tons to survive, so 2 million tons of flour is coming in, but they need more like 10 million tons for the sheep meat, for the livestock. So you can do the math. And Cynthia, it's done for every country, and the dimensions of this could be met. And I'll add one thing to say back about the United States. It's this globalist farm food complex that has altered the practices and laws in Washington, D.C., also London and Brussels and elsewhere. It's not, the American farmer has been kept in the dark. He or she knows nothing, even about farmers on the streets in Europe or India, knows nothing about Afghanistan, because there's nothing on the nightly news, the weekend news, the occasional documentary, because guess what? The impulse, still residual impulse to be an American among farmers in Iowa or Nebraska or Alabama to say, what? These people don't have food? We could take care of that. Can be taken care of. We can work that out. We can produce here. We can have exchange programs. But instead, you are told, if you're a farmer, that you have to deal with business, agribusiness, not agriculture. You have to compete. You have to keep your head down, play sports, grow your crops. And if you can't do it anymore, just go belly up. And one of the highest suicide rates is in the farm states. The highest drug rates is in the farm states. The highest lack of hospital beds is in the farm states. This is part of the world picture of the crisis. And back to then one thing about mitigation or redirect or what we can do. Let's take a couple of lies, because it isn't just a blackout of information. But if you look at when the pandemic just began, what was Ukraine's role in the world of where did they export most to? Well, they were oriented to 32% of their agriculture exports went to the European Union. They sent corn to Spain for the cattle. They sent wheat to Italy. They sent food to the Netherlands, which in money terms is the second biggest agriculture exporter in the world, in money terms. So Ukraine barley fed some of the livestock in the Netherlands. Another 45% of Ukraine's food exports in 2019 went to China and India. Good. India got oil seeds, sunflower oil and stuff like that. So only 14% went to Africa, mostly Egypt and North Africa. Good. It was part of the world commercial market. So then last year, after the disruption, most of this didn't change when in the summer, the Black Sea Grain Initiative came into being, thanks to the initiative of Turkey, Russia, and it got going. The grain tended to go to the same places. And Putin, who's supposed to be considered a demon, said, by the way, your grain's going to the same places. Why don't you change where it goes and send more of it to needy places? But that's not how it works. This was so extreme. And I'm sorry to take time. I have to tell you one thing. I looked up what Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, said in September. He sent out a tweet about how wonderful Ukraine was doing under the new Black Sea Grain Initiative. He said, quote, in September, despite its own suffering in the face of Russia's brutal invasion, Ukraine has donated 30,000 metric tons of grain through the World Food Program to alleviate Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis. That was a tweet. The rest of the tweet was, and Ukraine is also sending thousands of tons to Ethiopia and Somalia. Well, they weren't donating it. In October, the State Department had to issue a correction. They said, State Department, in September, we tweeted about grain shipments to Ethiopia, Somalia, and Afghanistan. To clarify, this is a quote, Ukraine funded grain for Ethiopia and Somalia. In fact, the grain shipments to Afghanistan were facilitated by the World Food Program through US funding. But I looked last night, that tweet of Tony Blinken's is still up. It still said Ukraine, out of the goodness of its heart, donated. No, Ukraine was part of the commercial world picture, which can be changed if enough citizens and the force of right comes to be to change these kinds of laws in Washington, London, and Brussels that Scott described, which is weaponizing the Western food capacity and lying about Ukraine. This is so cut and dried. I just had to give a few examples.
Scott?
No, I mean, Marcia's 100% correct. This is again, Marcia, what do you call it? The World Food?
I was just fooling around with making it up. How about Globalist Farm Food Complex?
There we go. The Globalist Farm Food Complex is dominated by the United States. It furthers American policy, plain and simple. The World Food Program, even though it's not an American food program, it's dominated by America. Nothing happens unless America wants it to happen. One of the key aspects of this, and Marcia brought up, once the food shipments were resumed out of Ukraine, Putin said, hey, out of the 87 ships that we sent out, I think only 2 went to the places that were starving. The rest of them, most of them went to to the European Union or to Turkey. And why is that the case? I mean, is Europe starving? And the answer is no. But see, part of this complex is that Europe is a driver of global food prices. When the war in Ukraine happened, look at Great Britain. Price of fish and chips went through the roof. People couldn't afford the basic staple because the price of flour and such went through the roof. Not because Britain was dependent upon Ukrainian grains, but because when you remove Ukrainian grains from the global market, you have a global shortage. And like anything, when you have a product that everybody wants and you don't have enough of it, the price goes through the roof. So one of the first things that had to happen wasn't to feed the starving people. It was to stabilize food prices in Europe. That was the number one priority. And that tells you something, that it's not about, the World Food Program isn't about helping starving people. It's about a food price stability for the West. The number one priority of the World Food Program is price stability, which is okay, but price stability can be achieved without, in a way that doesn't address the starvation issue, which is happening right now. And this is where I think the impetus for change is going to come, because Russia is calling them out. I mean, again, the most evil man on the planet, Vladimir Putin, God bless his soul, is apparently doing horrible things, such as saying maybe we should give away food for free to the starving people. Maybe the 300 tons of fertilizer that you seized on Russian shipping in the ports, we'll give that away for free to the farmers that need it. That way we don't have to worry about sanctions and money and all that stuff. We're just going to give it to the people that need it. And the West is aghast, because if you give it away for free, you're starting to play with the various accounting calculations that go into pricing of food. China and India are also looking at this because they understand that they are vulnerable to, to world food shortages, and they're huge populations. And when you start messing with food supply, you could have gigantic, domestic consequences, famines that kill millions. They don't want that. And I think the world is waking up to the fact that this global food complex that's out there doesn't serve the world. It doesn't serve the needy. It serves the interests of the United States and Europe primarily. And it serves them by keeping prices stable so that they can afford to buy the food they need to live. As we shift away geopolitically, and one of the things that's happening because of the Ukraine conflict is the world is starting to recognize that the era of American singularity is past, and they're seeking to move towards a multipolar world. And as you do that, I think you're going to see, because what is the World Food Program part of? It's part of what we call the rules-based international order that the United States has imposed on the world to control the world. And look at the national security strategy of the United States published by Biden, but even prior to that, we promote the rules-based international order as the most important thing for global stability, but it's not. It's the most important thing for the sustainment of American domination of the world. And the world is rejecting it. Russia and China have come together and said, the day of the rules-based international order is over. We're replacing it with the law-based international order, the law being the United Nations Charter. And I think you're going to see much of the rest of the world gravitate in that direction. And when you do, Marcia, I think what we're going to see is that the world is going to start to demand changes in the way that the world food is managed, so that common sense approaches towards mitigation can be implemented, not policies that solely benefit the American government.
I haven't seen much of this on the news. I read the article in the New York Times, and the New York Times puts the blame on Russia. So therefore, there's kind of a news blackout with regard to this issue. We in this country, there's so many people that are suffering from hunger right now, and they're worried about their themselves and their families and their friends. So if all of what I just said is the case, when people in this country are worried about having enough to eat here, then they're not as concerned about people in Africa who might be starving. So how do we make people realize that we're in a global situation? There's hunger in this country, but there's hunger in other parts of the world. Marcia?
Well, we have to do everything to break the blackout, and people will pick up on it right away if they have any access to it, because everything is done to make sure you do not connect any dots for a bigger picture. You do not. It's so venal that people can even be told here, you're suffering because too much is being done by the United States to help the hungry in Africa. These are utter evil lies. And I think that, let me just throw one thing in here, because Scott has referred to the fact we're in a period, or we're at a potential point where people can perceive changes, or shifts are being made, or we can make them. Look, we have about 8 billion people in the world today, I understand, since November. If you go by an old-fashioned military type metric from the Second World War, that you want 1/2 ton of grain or equivalent produced for every person, or at least 1/3 of a ton in the world, you should be producing something like 4 billion tons of grain, okay? You know what we're producing? Less than 3 billion. And a great deal of that, fair enough, grain goes into chickens and piggies and everything for sausages in Europe and South America. So we are way underproducing on a worldwide basis. And that we already talked about how that shows up in certain areas as starvation or on the way to starvation. So what do you want people to know? It isn't just people are starving somewhere else and also we're in trouble. We can produce this amount. It takes things like water projects out in the West. We haven't built any water projects in North America since the Great California Water Project. It takes pipelines of ammonia. It takes all kinds of things. And nobody thinks of making any of these connections, but they can be made. We have to have this policy shift. The reason for the evil weaponizing of food coming out of Washington, D.C. is this complex of the food commodities wing of the City of London and Wall Street that has the metals commodities, that has the food processing commodities, that has the fertilizer commodities. And once you begin to know it, you can know what you want to fight for. You want to fight for the conditions it's certainly in the common interest of all people is having sufficient food. And we need to, roughly speaking, double the volume of world production on a worldwide basis. And so that's why we get lies about Mr. Putin himself. We also get diversions, Cynthia. The media will tell you, you should be concerned about food waste. Well, of course we are. Any normal person doesn't want to waste food. You should be concerned about, in other words, the manipulation of our passions along with the blackout of information is at a very extreme point, but we can break that open.
Scott?
Sorry, I was coughing. I didn't want my my coughing to disrupt everybody. I would just second everything Marcia said, and she talks about manipulation. There's a I read the same New York Times article, Cynthia. It's garbage. It's 100% garbage. I don't know what's happened to quality control in the New York Times. It's purely a propaganda piece. It's a hit job on Putin and Russia. And one of the reasons why you know that is that they bring up the Holodomor, the famine of 1932, 1933, that took place not just in Ukraine but in all of southern Russia, in northern Caucasus area. Millions of people starve to death. And it's part of the narrative of the Ukrainian nationalism that the Holodomor was an effort by Stalin and the Russians to break the will of Ukraine and the spirit of Ukrainian nationals, etc. I think history shows that's not the case. It was a byproduct of drought, famine, bad food management, all coming together at a time, and it was tragic. But they try to equate that with what's happening today, as if today we have an effort by Russia to use famine and use food to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. And while, I mean, propaganda is propaganda. And people can say, sure, okay, so what, Scott? It's just propaganda, war of words, except that if you're defining that problem, the problem of the Ukraine-driven famine as being derived from Russian policy, I just come back to something I've always said about everything. If you don't define the problem correctly, you can't come up with a solution. So if you're defining the problem about the famine that's been developed because of this Ukraine conflict, and you're blaming it solely on Russia and saying that Putin's trying to be the new Stalin and using famine as a weapon to suppress Ukrainian nationalism, whatever solution you come up with to address that problem isn't going to solve the problem of global famine, because you're solving the wrong problem. You're not solving the real problem. You're solving nothing. You're solving a problem that doesn't exist. And that's the problem with the New York Times piece, is that, Marcia said there's a blackout, but it's worse than that, Marcia. It's not just a blackout. It's an effort to misinform. It's an effort to shape opinions, to form opinions, to deviate away from fact-based reality to this fantasy-based fiction that the United States, through, unfortunately, what has become, in effect, state-sponsored media here in the United States, the New York Times, the Washington Post, other mainstream media outlets. They used to be independent media, pursuing things that they thought would benefit the general good of the people, but they've become little more than mouthpieces for the US government. And in doing so, they lead people to believe they're being informed, Marcia. You see that one of the problems is that people, when they say there's a blackout, people say, no, Marcia, I just read an article about it in the New York Times. I'm fully informed. But you're not. You're ignorant because you've been given bad information that you embraced fully and absorbed it, believing you were being told the truth, but you're being fed lies. So it's worse than just a blackout. A blackout can be cured by shining light. But right now, we have people shining spotlights that are designed to make people think we're being given the truth, but it's actually blinding them to what the real problems are. So this is a big problem. How do you work through that? How do you navigate through that? How do we take on? Because I think this is a very valuable discussion we're having right here. But how does this discussion go up against the New York Times? I mean, yes, we're gonna link this. People are gonna watch it. They're gonna listen to it, and some people might, say, "Hey, I got some questions. I learned something new, etc." But the New York Times has not just national reach, but global reach. They sort of set the tenor, so to speak, for very important stories. And so around the world, the information warfare being waged about starvation is being driven, dominated by outlets like the New York Times, whereas people like Marcia, you, Cynthia, and to a lesser extent myself on this issue, we're trying to get some fact-based narrative out there. It's an uphill struggle. It's a very uphill struggle. But I thank you, Cynthia, for doing this, and Marcia, I thank you for also helping shine light on a very important topic.
So, Marcia, what's on your plate for 2023?
Well, one thing, and I agree with Scott about saying that you misdefine any problem on purpose, and that's weaponizing the mind. In fact, that's attempted mind control. I'm glad to say that I know I've been involved, and it's through the Schiller Institute and other auspices in international farmer discussions on spreading the word, on on the real problems in the country, in the world, as I mentioned, that we are vastly underproducing the volume of food, which has to do with this lingering perpetuation of the Wall Street, City of London dirty operations in the realm of all commodities and food, and working together on getting out what the conditions are that are necessary to supply sufficient food. For example, one thing that came up in the discussion we just had, when you have soaring prices due to speculation, when you have, just like spot markets for energy in Amsterdam and Europe, and you have speculation on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange on food items and on inputs to farming, chemicals and fertilizers, it's a sovereign power of government that this has to be stopped and can be stopped. You can also provide special credits to farming if you want to increase output, even in a short period of time. You can put moratoria on any bankruptcies. This has been done. There are sets of kinds of policies that have precedence in different countries and different parts of the world, whether it's India or whether it's the United States under Abraham Lincoln. So there are networks at work, and it seems uphill, but in the context of how extreme everything is, these networks are working to spread the word on the real solutions that we should take, including good old garden variety bust up antitrust of the interlock of the kinds of companies. I mentioned some of the names, whether it's JBS or Cargill Mosaic and Fertilizers or Louis Dreyfus or Bunge, ABCD as it's called in Ukraine and elsewhere, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus, that this isn't pie in the sky. This is an immediate kind of thing we should be working towards. And that's what I'm very much involved with, Cynthia, in the new year, right at the present time.
Scott, what's on your plate for 2023?
I have to stop coughing. So that's the number one priority in 2023 is to stop coughing. Look, this Ukraine conflict, it's not something that I wanted to happen. Nobody wanted this to happen except, I believe, NATO, the West, Ukraine. But I'm caught up in it now. It's I put sweat equity into the issue. So unfortunately, as this war drags on, I'm going to, I think, be putting a lot of my effort into trying to provide balanced assessments and analysis about Ukraine, but also about broader geopolitical issues, energy security issues, and increasingly, as Marcia's highlighted, things such as water security and food security are becoming some of the dominant issues of our day. If you don't think that the global geopolitics will be impacted by 1 billion starving people, you don't know what 1 billion starving people are capable of doing to save their own lives. And we're talking about the potential of mass migration, continent-wide conflict as the haves have to fight off the have-nots who are coming to get what they have just to survive. So, we're in a world that's in transition, a world that's on the cusp of so many potential disasters. And as Marcia said, the vast majority of the American people are operating in an information blackout. And so I think what I'm going to be doing in 2023 is using whatever skill set I have and whatever opportunity I have to try and help lift this blackout and shine some important light on some very important issues so that the American people can be informed and have the ability to engage responsibly in debate, dialogues, and discussions about the very critical issues that define, their security and the security of their children going forward.
How's your website coming along?
I think it's going okay. I mean, I don't, Cynthia, if you haven't learned this about me by now, let me educate you. I am a Luddite. I barely know how to turn on a computer, let alone operate a website. So I have, in classic Marine Corps officer fashion, I have delegated that responsibility to somebody else. They seem to be doing a very good job. I'm pleased with what they're doing. So, we're looking to find ways to, the purpose of the website isn't just to have a website. It's scoutritterextra.com, but it's to serve as a facilitator of information gathering and information dissemination. And it appears to be doing that well. We're looking at ways to expand that potential in the coming year. In fact, as tonight, I think I'll be talking about some of that at the library tonight. Some initiatives that might be attractive to people, especially those who are of the anti-war persuasion.
And how's your book coming along?
Well, it's going well. Remember, it's not a mainstream publisher. It's not Simon and Schuster or Random House. So I don't have the support of a massive infrastructure. But for what it is, the book's going well. It's getting out there to a wider audience, and I hope to continue to promote it again. Not simply just to sell books, although as a writer that's always important, or you'll starve to death. But the most important thing is the information that's contained in the book, I think, is extraordinarily relevant to the situation today in trying to find a path towards conflict resolution between Russia and the United States. So I call the book a template of hope, but the template of hope is useless if people aren't aware of it. So I'm doing my best to get the knowledge of the book and what it contains out there to a broader public, and hopefully.
And the name of the book is?
The name of the book is Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union.
And why should people take a look at it?
Well, one, it's just a fascinating history of a topic, arms control, that most people aren't aware of. And yet everybody understands the importance of controlling nuclear weapons. I think all but the insane would say, oh, we're not worried about nuclear weapons. I think most people say we are very worried about it, especially in the context of what's going on in Ukraine right now with the potential of nuclear war between NATO and Russia, the United States and Russia. So arms control is something that can help mitigate that, to alleviate the threat of nuclear war. The book is about the first disarmament treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the role I played in bringing this treaty to fruition, to implement this treaty, overcoming unimaginable obstacles. It's a story that's never been told anywhere else, nor can it be told anywhere else, given the fact that I possess the archive that allowed it to be written. But it's also a book about how the United States and the Soviet Union came together despite all the obstacles. As bad as things are today between Russia and the United States, anybody who lived in the 1980s knows it was pretty bad back then too. Back then, some people would say it was even more dangerous back then. But we were able to get the evil empire, that's Soviets, to sit down with enemy number one, that's America, and come up with this peace treaty that removed nuclear weapons from the table and began a process of cooperation towards learning to live together out of mutual respect and mutual prosperity and mutual peace. We can do it again, but you can't do it if you don't know the lessons of history. This book is the history lesson on arms control and the importance of arms control. If you read this book, you not only understand what happened in the past, but why that's relevant to the problem set we face today.
I'm sure that we will have a number of discussions in 2023. Marcia, it's been great talking to you. And Scott, we'll talk later on today.
Okay.
So you've been listening to Issues That Matter. And if you like this show, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Marcia. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Happy New Year and have a great day.
Thank you.